The father in the book of Proverbs has an idea about how his son's education is intended to progress. And what we get in Proverbs chapter 2 is lesson number 2. In our last session, we looked at lesson number 1. In this session, we're looking at lesson number 2. And his message here, I think, is to keep to the good path. He does this by beginning to explain to the son what education really should look like. And because he sort of sets all of this up, we have actually the 11 verses here that constitute the introduction, his sort of bracing the son or preparing the son for what is about to come. Now, when we get to the teaching itself, the actual content of the lesson, we are going to meet a couple of characters. Just like we have encountered other characters before, we're going to here encounter two main characters, which are the wicked man and we're going to encounter the forbidden woman. And so as the teaching actually progresses, we find ourselves sort of wrestling with what do we do with these characters as they show up. However, because he is trying to sort of lay out the education process before the son really gets much into the lesson itself, I think it's helpful for us to try to understand what's happening. Michael Fox says that education here has two phases. First is teaching with the student's internalization and inquiry. The student is intended to sort of to ask and to try to process and inquire. And then the second step, which is that God gives wisdom. Since the second that God gives follows one, the first step, right? Faith becomes then an essential part of this. In other words, I have to start down the educational journey believing that the second thing is going to happen. I can only take care of the first part. I have to trust that God is going to take care of the second part. And so I wonder if it would help for us to begin to just sort of imagine the educational process to look something like this. First of all, the student begins with a position of fear, right? Like we had in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, like we have in Proverbs chapter 9, the beginning of knowledge or the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The student positions himself or herself with knowledge that God is awesome, that God is in control and sovereign. And it's in that position then that they're better equipped to begin this educational journey. The second step then is that the student seeks. Here, the student begins to seek after wisdom, to try to understand it, to probe and to try to figure out what wisdom might actually look like in their life. And as they begin to seek, God actually begins to give. And here, as God begins to give, he dispenses wisdom. He bestows wisdom on those who are seeking after his face, those who are curious about it. And because God is giving that, then the student grows. And because the student is growing, it's leading to a fear of the Lord. And so we can begin to see sort of the cycle that this takes place, that takes place because of this, right? The student fears, which leads to the student seeking, which then leads to God giving, which then leads to the student growing, which then leads to the student fearing even more. And what's interesting to sort of think about as we imagine this educational process, it's to realize that for these first two stops along the journey, the student really is in control, right? The student is seeking and the student is fearing. The student is the one who's orienting themselves to the task. But in these last two stops, it really is God who is in control. God is the one who's guiding and directing and providing the growth as it is happening. And so, Michael Fox says, wisdom is not simply knowing what to do. It's about desiring the right things. It's about orienting yourself in the right way, right? We're not simply after this piece right here, right? Where God's giving wisdom. Wisdom, really, in order to get to this stop right here, we also have to orient ourselves correctly by desiring the right things. So we begin with fear, and then we begin to seek after the things that the Lord wants us to seek after. Now, here's what he says in Proverbs chapter 2, starting in verse 1. My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you. So notice here, you have to accept the words and store them up. Learning, it seems, takes a commitment. Much like learning to ride a bike, one has to be committed to the task before they can really do much of anything with it, right? I have 5 children, and for me, teaching my kids how to ride a bike, I've been impressed time and time again that really it involves a commitment on their part. I can be willing to teach them, but if they're not willing to learn, if they're not willing to get on that bike and to try it out as they begin to ride on their own, then we're not going to go much of anywhere. And so, just in this way, the process of learning or education actually requires a commitment, an investment on the part of the student. They have to be willing to enter into it and treasure these things. Verse 2, listen closely to wisdom, directing your heart to understanding. Notice here, I'm directing my ears and my heart to the task. It is not some sort of passive task here, but rather I actually have to be actively involved in directing my ears and heart to what is at hand. Verse 3, furthermore, if you call out to insight and lift your voice to understanding. Notice the shift here, right? We were passive in verse 2. We were willing to listen and incline our heart, right? These are more passive things. We're just paying attention to what is being given. But now in verse 3, we're actually actively seeking it out, right? I'm calling out to insight. I'm lifting my voice to begin to try to understand. Verse 4, if you seek it like silver and search for it like hidden treasure, we're going on an expedition here, right? We're trying to seek it out. We're trying to find it. This is part of what we're talking about here. We're seeking. And now, verse 5, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. Part of the challenge of all of this, right, is that the reward, the knowledge of God, wisdom, is also the place we have to start, right? Now, as I grow in wisdom, I know that the Lord is great and awesome and sovereign, and I realize that he is to be feared. So I'm going to get that as God gives me wisdom, but I also have to have a measure of that in order to begin to start the process in the first place, right? I have to, in some sense, recognize that I stand in awe of Almighty God before I can even start on the journey itself. And so, if I do verses 1 through 4, the promise seems to be that then I will get it. Michael Fox also notes, knowledge of God is never mere cognition of facts. Rather, it's action. Right? Knowing that God is who he is. Biblically, knowing God is more than just being able to mentally assent to a list of facts about him. Rather, it is actually action, right? It involves us orienting ourselves to God in a certain way. Verse 6, for the Lord gives wisdom. Here we are. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. Verse 7, he stores up success for the upright. He is a shield for those who live with integrity. Resourcefulness, it seems, is reserved for the righteous. It's possible that even the translation here, he is a shield for those who live with integrity. It's possible that the righteousness itself almost becomes the shield, right? That protects us from these things. So verse 8, he may guard the paths of justice and protect the way of his faithful followers. And so what's happening here is God's sort of stepping in to help. Verse 9, then you will understand righteousness, justice, and integrity, every good path. These are the big 3 from Proverbs chapter 1 that we looked at before. In verse 10, wisdom will enter your heart. Knowledge will delight you. Notice the sort of passive nature here that we've shifted back into. If I pursue and God gives, now I'm going to find that these things are just happening to me, right? I'm growing and I'm not even necessarily actively seeking the growth here in this moment. Verse 11, discretion will watch over you. Understanding will guard you. And here we're given almost this caricature of these features, these character traits that become almost my guardians as I seek the Lord. And so if I'm willing to enter into this journey, no matter how imperfect my fear of the Lord might be at the beginning, God says, if you enter into this, if you're willing to fear, if you're willing to seek, God will give. And that will sort of put you in this wonderful cycle of education and growth. Now we get to the content of the teaching, starting in verse 12. It does it in two parts, right? We have one in verses 12 to 15 and one in verses 16 through 19. Here's what it says. It will rescue you from the way of evil, from the paths that are evil, and from anyone who says perverse things. The man here is described in 7 ways. He's deceptive. He distorts reality. In short, he is a crooked man. From those who abandon the right paths to walk in ways of darkness. From those who enjoy doing evil and celebrate perversion. And then sort of the final one here, whose paths are crooked, whose ways are devious. In other words, if you will enter into this journey, you will be saved from the people out there who are crooked, from what we might call the wicked man. All of these things will save us from these realities that might come up as we begin to move through life. So if you will be willing to commit yourself to the Lord, you will find that all of this actually saves you from the wicked people around you. It's not just the wicked man, though, that you will be saved from, but also the forbidden woman. It says this in verse 16, I will rescue you from a forbidden woman, from a wayward woman with her flattering talk. This woman here, who we will meet several times throughout the book of Proverbs, is just this strange or perhaps other woman. She seems to be all too eager to abandon all her commitments. Now, the text is not explicit here about adultery. We will get to other texts later on in Proverbs 1 through 9 that specifically mention adultery and her desire to entice or seduce the youth. However, what we have here is really just the other woman or this strange woman. The description given is just she's someone else who seems to have abandoned her commitments and is all too willing to bring the youth along with her, who abandons the companion of her youth, verse 17, forgets the covenant of her God, for her house sinks down to death, and her ways to the land of the departed spirits, verse 19, none return who go to her, none reach the paths of life. In other words, she is on her way to Sheol herself, and she's eager to drag other people down with her. And so, then, it seems the word in verse 20 begins the summary. If we're keeping away from the wicked man, if we're steering away from the forbidden woman, then this looks like we a path, traveling along the path that will keep us like we need to go. It's the good path, right? We stay away from the wicked people. We stay away from the forbidden woman. And in the process, then, we're preserved. We are protected. So the summary, follow the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. As you're walking down this road, you will encounter others, right? Other people who are traveling along this path with you. These are the good people, the righteous people, those who seek to honor the Lord. So stick to that path and you will stay with them. Verse 21, for the upright will inhabit the land, and those of integrity will remain in it, but the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous ripped out of it. Notice the contrasting fates here. Those who choose the way of the righteous will find themselves prospering. Those who choose the way of the wicked will find themselves destroyed. I think again of Psalm chapter 1. There, as God begins to sort of explain for us, I think, how the realities of life play themselves out. It's the one whose delight is in the law of the Lord that finds themselves flourishing. They're like a tree planted by streams of water who gives its fruit in season. Everything that he does prospers. His leaf does not wither. All of these different ways that the Lord is showering him and protecting him and flourishing him, providing him life. Notice he doesn't always produce fruit, right? It's just fruit in its season, but not so the wicked, right? They're like chaff that the wind just blows away. They're not going to be able to stand in the counsel of the righteous. They won't be able to endure judgment because the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. It's as if the Lord is sort of shining his face or bringing his light, bringing his hope onto this good path. And so the Father is encouraging us here, stay on that good path. God's eyes are on it. God's face is on it. God's light is on the good path. And the more you find yourself on that path, the more you will find yourself basking in the glory of God's goodness. However, if you steer off the good path, if you turn from that and you join with the wicked man and the forbidden woman, you'll find yourself headed down a path of destruction. Sometimes God may step in and speed up your destruction. At other times, this is just the inevitable way that this path goes. It is a path that leads to death. And so you shouldn't be surprised when those who are on it find themselves headed towards absolute destruction. And so I think the Father's word in this second lesson here is just to us to make sure we keep to the good path. As we begin to sort of orient ourselves to life and even try to understand how the education process works, how we might begin to become more and more wise, we realize that we have a part to play and that God has a part to play. And if we're willing to enter into this journey, if we're willing to keep to the good path, God says, I will bring so many good things to you. This is the way of wisdom, to keep to the path that is good.